Welcome to the Marlin Fitzwater Center for Communication at Franklin Pierce University in Rindge, New Hampshire. I am Kristen Nevius, Director of the Center, and it is my privilege to have you with us for what promises to be a riveting session of the Presidency in the Press, our high school journalism program for New Hampshire students and teachers, which is supported so generously in part by the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. The relationship between the American presidency and the press is deep and nuanced. As the Washington Post's Lindsay Beaver noted less than 1 month into the Trump presidency, Thomas Jefferson, our nation's third president, who found himself beset by partisan politics, invented hating the media. Yet Jefferson also readily acknowledged the critical role the press played in our democracy. And over the course of our nation's history, through periods of peace and war, the two institutions, the presidency and the press, developed a strong working relationship grounded in respect. Here to talk about that relationship's rules of engagement are two people whose distinguished careers intersected at the White House, one representing the president and his agenda, and the other representing the institution of the press. Peter Maer covered 6 presidents for various news networks from 1976 through his retirement from CBS Radio in 2014. And Bruce Zanca served 3 presidents as spokespersons and communication strategist. Please join me in welcoming to the Fitzwater Studios Peter Maer and Bruce Zanca.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Well, I brought along with me a resource, and I think this is probably the manual for what we are discussing, called The Briefing by Marlin Fitzwater, who, of course, this fine place honors Marlin and bears his name. This is a great resource for you. I really commend it to everyone about the relationship between the media, the news media, and the presidency. So I'm going to read from it just something very brief to set the stage for our discussion, and I think it really does. And again, this is from Marlin's book. He said, "The press are always with me, a permanent part of the equation. Press secretaries," Marlin says, "do not make policy, nor does the press. But together we make a difference at the margin. Together we are an appendage of the presidency that ties the daily deliberations of government to the American people." He said, "I'm proud of that role and of my media family. We are a curious and strange lot." If you would like to read the elaboration, it's in Marlin's book. I'm not getting any commission from Marlin to promote his book. He also said that the press secretary to the president stands between the opposing forces, explaining, cajoling, begging, sometimes pushing both sides to a better understanding of each other. So I give you that as sort of the baseline for our discussion today. And again, I remind you that Mr. Fitzwater was the only press secretary who served 2 presidents, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and that fact itself really says a lot about his wealth of experience. So with that, we're going to talk, and I love the title of this, Bruce, Rules of Engagement. You usually think of rules of engagement in terms of war, but this is a great topic, and there are some rules of the road that we're also going to talk about. I don't know if we want to launch into that now, or
I think so. Let me see if I can put this in context a little bit. So there's some nomenclature. There's some syntax. There's some common kind of rules of the road in dealing with the news media. And and as I was preparing for this session in the last couple of days, I was talking to one of my neighbors over dinner, and he said, "Well, I don't understand why anybody would ever have to talk off the record." And I told him that there's many legitimate reasons to be able to talk off the record. One of the things that you want to be able to do is to, and our job as a press secretary, is to help steer the press in their inquiries. And so to understand what the reporter's question is and asking them it's often quite useful to have conversations where you can give and take and have a dialogue and ask questions and get to the meat of the point without being on the record, so there are no misunderstandings in what take place. So I think the first thing that you have to understand, and Peter has a list of terms that we can go through and talk about these, is that as a spokesperson, I don't have the right to go off the record. It's a transaction. I can request to go off the record, and then the reporter can grant me that opportunity to go off the record, and then we can go off that. And that is a social contract between the journalist and the spokesperson.
Good way to put it.
If Peter and I are having a conversation, and I say, well, Peter, I'd like to help you with that question, but could we go off the record first? I might say, I'll come back on the record later on to help you get to the point that you need to be able to do, and then we can kind of talk about the give and take. Maybe his premise for the story that he has is skewed. Maybe he's got some misinformation. Maybe there's some other information that I can lend towards the conversation that will help give context and explain what is happening on that. I can tell you over the years, many, many, many times, I've helped a reporter from making a mistake by being off the record, helping them not to make a mistake by being off the record, by steering them away from a story that they were maybe running out in front of, getting over their skis on, if you will, and taking a look at that. But to understand, we have to agree to the rules of attribution. Some of the terms are off the record, which means it can't be reported, it can't be talked about. Do you have a list there of
I
those?
do.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
do. And I would caution all of you that if someone specifies one of these rules or one of these agreements to you, make sure that you and your interview subject agree on what it means. So let me go through these quickly. On the record is just what the term conveys. Everything discussed is for direct quotes, direct attribution to the person speaking or being interviewed. And this is really, as reporters, what you want to strive for, to have things on the record. Then there's this term, background. Can I speak to you on background? Or I'm going to give you some information that is on background. And this is information that can be quoted and attributed to however this person wants to be described. Senior administration official. I have to tell you parenthetically, in all my years of 40 or so years on the White House beat, nobody ever asked to be called a junior administration official. There were a lot of people who wanted to be called senior administration officials who certainly were not senior administration officials, but I digress. They might want to be called senior administration official or government official, or however they wish to be identified to you and to your readers, listeners, viewers, as being on background.
And the reporter and the subject should agree to that attribution rule before you go
exactly.
forward with it.
As I say, make sure that you both understand what the definition is. I have to tell you, there are a number of press secretaries or functionaries who didn't really know at least what my sense of what it meant to go on background. Now, this, just to put it into context, this is often a vehicle for officials who want to convey information without being identified by name because they don't want to steal the thunder of the senator or the president. So they will say, can I go on background? And there are other motivations for it that I think are pretty obvious for you. Then there's a sort of what I think is kind of an arcane thing, and it took me a while when I first heard this to really figure out what was meant. Deep background. Deep background. So there's, the way I've always understood it is there's no direct quoting or using any details that could identify a source who says, I'm going to give you some information that's on deep background. So when I dealt reluctantly with someone who wanted to go on deep background, and I also have to digress a minute and say a lot of this is just peculiar to Washington. I'd find it hard to believe that someone, unless they had some Washington experience, somebody in the state capitol here or in a city council chambers would say, I want to talk to you on deep background. They might find another way to put it. But anyway, when I dealt with someone who said they were going on deep background and they gave me some information, again, you couldn't use, direct quotes, but I'd usually paraphrase it on the air, or if I was writing a web piece, by saying, it is understood that such and such is going to happen, or it is understood that the administration is preparing to do this or that, or that the president believes something. So that would always be my qualifier to signal to my audience that I couldn't get somebody to, you could also say, that officials would not speak to you on the record, but it's understood that such and such, which conveys to your audience and to your readers and so forth that you spoke to someone and they did give you information. Then finally, the last one is off the record. And off the record means what it says. The information is totally off the record. Sources often go off the record because they want to share information. They want to put you onto something that they're not in a position to directly be quoted on or want to be connected with in any way. As a reporter, I almost always tried to get sources to at least up it to background when they started going down the off-the-record trail, in order to salvage a quote or at least some information that I could put in my stories. I remember once, without going into too much detail, that I was going to be in a situation, and I was told going in that this is going to be off the record. It's all going to be off the record. Everything you see here, you're not in a position to report on it, and what you hear. It was just kind of a sensitive situation. And then the subject of this off-the-record setting took me aside and gave me a little tour of an area and so forth, and the person who had told me that it was off the record was not there. He was, had been removed from the situation. So he said to me, well, what happened when you were, I said, well, I can't tell you. You told me that this was going to be off the record, and I can't really discuss it with you. And so he pushed and pushed and pushed, and he said, well, just let me ask you one question. Did he mention my name? And I said, no. This was a guy who was a spokesman who worked for someone. And I said, no, I can't tell you whether he mentioned your name, but, well, okay, he didn't mention your name, but that's off the record. So that was my way of getting back at him for putting everything off the record. So, I guess the main point of all of this is try to get things on the record.
I would I can give you an example on speaking on background from my business experience. So I worked for a big internet company, and sometimes I would get a call from a trade press reporter or maybe a Wall Street Journal reporter to ask a question about a competitor. They were working on a trend story on something that was happening in our industry. And it wouldn't make sense for me to, they might have a question about, I'm going to tell you exactly, since it happened in the past. A reporter asked me about something about Google's search algorithm. And, as a guy in the internet business, I didn't want to pick any fights with Google. But I wanted to be able to steer the reporter towards asking the right questions of Google when they had the interview. So on background, I said what Google is doing is, gave them the kind of information that they did. I ended up not actually being in the story, but later on that same reporter asked questions to Google, and based on the information that I had given them in my interview, they were able to ask more poignant questions and got to the answer they want. So as a spokesperson, it was a useful tool for me to be able to help the journalists do their job, but kind of inoculate myself from trouble or strife with behemoth in the internet industry and taking a look at it. So I can tell you this, as a spokesperson and as a PR person, there's truly nothing that's really off the record. If you can't have it be in the newspaper or read about it, don't say it.
Great guidance.
Is the great advice that I'd have, because there is no truly off the record. But if you have a relationship with a journalist, or a journalist has a relationship with a spokesperson, and there is that kind of level of mutual respect and trust, and you can mutually agree on the rules of attribution, it's something that's routinely done and effectively done, and is a good way to communicate. Now, the point that Peter made about often somebody wanting to be on background ahead of time, think a little bit about. I could tell you how we would devise events at the White House when there was that. We might think about a particular week in time having a theme. So in the spring when it's graduation time, we might want to talk about the country's infrastructure and what needed to be done in that. And there was going to be a series of college graduation speeches where the president would go out and talk about these kind of things. You might want to have a background session with reporters to give them the texture, background, significance, what some of the policy points were coming up, future legislation, those kind of ideas. But you wouldn't want to do it for attribution as a spokesperson and all of that, because you knew 2 days from now the president was going to make a speech about this. So it was an opportunity to kind of do the planning and the homework and plant the seeds for the information as a spokesperson. And then when the actual words were spoken by the president or the vice president, whoever the principal was that was going to make the speech, that there'd be an opportunity to attribute those real words to them. So
you had context, and the backgrounders were very helpful to reporters, and that's kind of different than an interview setting where someone would all of a sudden say, I want to go on background with this.
Yeah. Well, quite often we would release speeches ahead of time on what was called an embargoed basis, where you'd want to give a reporter like Peter an opportunity to do his work and plan for the speech and what was going to be said ahead of time. And so you would give him a copy of the speech ahead of time. He could kind of pre-do his work on that, but it would be embargoed for the delivery by the president.
It would say
later on.
Say the president was going to speak at 6:30 p.m. Local time, Eastern time. It would say on the top of it, HFR, hold for release for that time. A friend of mine, Ron Fournier, who you have mentioned, the former veteran Associated Press correspondent at the White House, he arrived there with Bill Clinton, having covered him in Little Rock. So he had a great depth of experience. He left political reporting not too long ago to run a business publication in Detroit. And he wrote a very instructive piece in the Atlantic magazine, about his political journalism lessons learned. And he included a reminder that everything is on the record, subject to control of reporters. In other words, you assume that something is on the record unless you are told otherwise. And Ron notes, and I agree, that any exceptions have to be approved in advance by you and by the person who you are interviewing. And he writes that before giving someone anonymity, ask yourself, am I doing this in service to my audience or to advance my ego? And I have to tell you, in that regard, and you probably as a spokesman could sense reporters like this. I didn't meet too many of them, but I sensed with some of the people that I met along the way that they enjoyed, that there were reporters who enjoyed being able to say a senior administration official told, the such and such Gazette or told me, because it gave their editors or perhaps their listeners, viewers, readers, the sense that, boy, this person is really connected. They're talking to somebody who is a senior administration official. Yeah. I remember a day that I arrived at a briefing around the desk of a White House press secretary, and we were all in the room getting ready to have what was called a gaggle, where the press secretary would speak to you about what was going to happen that day. And again, you go in assuming everything is on the record unless you're told otherwise. And a reporter said to the press secretary, can we put this on background? He asked, can we put this on background? I was astounded, and along with a couple of other people, just really exploded. Why would you want this on background when he's sitting right here at his desk and he's speaking on the record unless he tells us otherwise?
Yeah. I'm convinced a couple of times over the course of my career that there were some reporters that attributed something to a senior administration official that I suspected that they made up out of whole cloth. I know that that's I
Wow.
don't have any way of proving that. You know, I generally think it's better to be on the record when you can be on the record. There are practical reasons
It's just best
not
for
to do
both
it,
sides,
but it's
isn't
best
it?
for both. I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
I really think so. You know, but you know, sometimes you suspect those things would happen.
The Associated Press has a style book, which you know maybe some of you have seen, and it's sort of the Bible for news operations. And newspapers have their own style books. Maybe your own schools have sort of a style book for your newspapers that set the rules. And in this article in the Atlantic, Ron Fournier quoted from the AP style book, and it says, "Whenever possible, we pursue information on the record. When the source insists on background or off-the-record ground rules, we must adhere to a strict set of guidelines."
You know, I would also say that the point that Peter made about people understanding the rules, particularly as you get, you know, away from Washington and other places, in the State House or in the City Hall, many people won't understand the rules and all of that. And you know, I've heard some mayors and city council people say things like, "That's off the record," and they say it after
Yeah.
it's been said. You know, so I think it's good to have the kind of conversations, particularly in an interview setting, with forethought to understand what the rules are, because you know you have to live to another day to report there too, and do all of that, and it's best to get those things done.
Yeah,
So,
that's a really cagey situation when someone has said, you know, outright said something, and then all of a sudden they realize, well, that's off the record. You know, you really struggle with it. As I said, Ron said that you have to, in the AP style book, you have to adhere to a set list of guidelines, and among those guidelines, as I look at my notes here, the AP says, first, the material is information, not opinion or speculation, and it is vital to the news report at hand. Second, the information is not available on the record. And third, and I think third is probably the most important, the source is reliable.
yeah. So what questions would you have? Yes. Well, you know, I think it's a really problematic time for the press and press secretaries and all that. You know, Peter talked about some of that in his keynote address, and tomorrow I'll talk about that in mine. Sometimes I think it's a very difficult time. I think a lot of that is driven from the top. You know, I don't really know Sean Spicer. I have friends that know him, and I've heard about him. And by all accounts, he's a skilled press secretary and does a good job. I think his client, the President of the United States, has put him in an impossible position, because you know quite often what happens is you know the president will contradict something that's said from the podium, and what's done on that, and so. That, along with the vitriol and tension that's being, you know, kind of perpetrated in Washington right now, where the press is being accused of being the enemy and all of that, I think it makes for hard relations. I think one of the things that you should understand about the White House press corps that I always thought, you know, was important is these are the people that are at the top of the craft. It's the pinnacle. You know, if you work your whole career as a journalist and do really well and do great assignments at the State House and at the City Hall and in the Congress, maybe you'll get to be a White House correspondent for an organization. And so the people that have done that, they're journeyman journalists. They're skilled. They know exactly what to do, and so they're used to these rules. So I think everybody understands fundamentally the rules and what's happening and all of that. I think the execution is probably a little more difficult about it, particularly when people are calling each other liars.
I think it's very tenuous to answer your terrific question. I think that this administration And again, I have not been in the briefing room in this administration, but watching it very closely and talking to colleagues there, I think this administration has purposefully sought to dramatically redefine the rules of engagement, if it even knows what the rules of engagement were going in. As I said, when I think of the term rules of engagement, I think about war. The military has a definition of rules of engagement for conflicts, and this administration has basically declared war on reporters. There's no doubt about it. Donald Trump has continued these fake news tirades that became a trademark during the campaign, and you see that his spokespeople have been hung out to dry repeatedly by being, they go out and they give the talking points, and then all of a sudden they're contradicted by the president or someone else, high on the staff. I don't ever recur seeing this recurring situation. It certainly never would have happened with Marlin Fitzwater, Mike McCurry, who was the spokesman for Bill Clinton during very difficult times. They knew, they had access, they knew what was going on, and they came out and they knew that you could take it to the bank with what they said. Many of you probably saw this disgusting repurposed wrestling video that Trump put out, where the body of the guy that Trump fake body slammed from several years back with the Wrestling Federation was photoshopped with the name CNN. And then the White House had the audacity to say that Trump never had ever advocated violence. And then, of course, all the networks started rerunning all of the ludicrous things that he said during the campaign, urging supporters to go after protesters at campaign rallies and promising to pay their expenses. So I think that, things are really tough now in terms of what the rules are. And you see that one day they throw I guess the baseball, I hate sports analogies when you're talking about news, but a change-up pitch or curveball to the White House briefing room. Well, today's briefing will be for audio only. No video is going to be allowed. We could talk all day about whether White House briefings should be televised, but really that horse or cow is out of the barn at this point. They have been televised for a long time, but they just keep changing the rules on the reporters at the White House. Where they turn the lights out. Maybe tomorrow we'll turn the lights on. So we could also discuss what the motivation is for all of that. There was also another really chilling development within the past week or so. The president of the White House Correspondents Association, a guy named Jeff Mason, who works for Reuters, revealed to members of the association at a meeting that the White House asked him to have the association criticize the work of an individual reporter who was left unnamed. I am told by colleagues who work in the White House that Spicer himself, Sean Spicer, has urged reporters to criticize the work of certain colleagues who the White House does not like their reporting. In response to all of this, Jeff Mason said that the job of reporters is to do their jobs. And he obviously, of course, rejected the White House call for the association, which really doesn't have any enforcement powers of any kind to single out some reporter for the kind of work they were doing. This, to me, having been on the beat for many years, is really very chilling.
Another question?
You mentioned many disadvantages to going off the record. Are there any advantages?
Well, I think there probably are from your standpoint. I think it's a matter of clarification. It's an opportunity. Like I said earlier, there might be times when a reporter is pursuing the vein of a story that they've got it wrong, or they've been misinformed, or somebody gave them a wrong point. And have you ever heard of that question, the rhetorical question, when did you stop beating your wife? Okay, if you ask me, when did I stop beating my wife? I said, I didn't stop beating my wife. Well, that means that I'm still beating my wife. I don't want to ask a question like that. If you were to ask me a question like that, I would say, could I go off the record? And you would say yes. I said, I've never beaten my wife. I'm never going to beat my wife. I don't know where you got this. How did you hear about this? And that's an opportunity for me to do it without kind of hanging myself out there to be quoted to say that I'm not beating my wife, because there's an implication that I was beating my wife in all of that. That's a useful opportunity to do that. And by the way, honey, I love you. I would never beat you. So I can.
I think you made a good point earlier that, frankly, I had not thought of, and that is, if you know that as a spokesperson for a politician or a corporate entity, if you happen to know that someone is heading down the wrong highway, you can go off the record and say, hey, look, I know for a fact that this just isn't right. Of course, you better be pretty sure that it's not right.
You're all wet on this, and you're going to make a mistake, and you're going to report on the wrong thing if you continue with this story. I've dissuaded many reporters over the years not to pursue a line of questioning when they've gotten something wrong, and I think they probably appreciated it.
But you better have plenty of respect for a spokesperson who tells you that. And you're going to be cynical and be cautious. But if it's someone who you've worked with for a long time and you know you can trust them, you're going to thank them, I would imagine, for telling you.
Yes?
Peter, have you ever asked an interviewee who wanted to give you information off the record not to proceed? Has it ever been to your advantage to avoid that? I'm thinking of an example of a local reporter where the police chief has given her information about who he thinks did a high-profile crime in her community, knowing that she can't use this, knowing that the crime isn't going to get solved for several years, that they're trying to make the case in Concord. Now she's carrying all of this information around that she cannot use. Have you ever not wanted to be burdened with that information?
No, I have not encountered that. And boy, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
No, but I can honestly say no, it's never happened to me.
Yeah.
So I've seen a number of spokespeople who are very artful in deflecting questions. A direct question is answered, and they manage to divert the question into the talking point that they want to steer to.
I'm pretty good at that.
and it sounds like you were well rewarded for it. So I guess my question is to you, which is, where does the reporter have the obligation, or how do they make that decision to, you didn't really answer my question, I need to ask you, and then they deflect again, and I need you to. So how do you make the determination at what point you're beating that dead horse?
Well, look, people in the podium position or an interview situation come in with their talking points, often supplied and distilled by the Bruce Zancas of the world. And I mean, there have been plenty of times in briefings where I was just sitting in my seat, just agitating about how many times do we have to listen to this same talking point over and over. And there were plenty of times where I said, okay, Mr. Press Secretary, Madam Press Secretary, we know your talking point, but answer the question. Sometimes you were successful, and sometimes you got a regurgitation of the same talking point.
I'd like to come back to your, what I think is a remarkable story about the White House Correspondents Association and Sean Spicer. And so I don't think it's a big leap to think that some in the administration would like the media to back off and think of them as. What I'm trying to get to is journalism backing away to this from this kind of pressure, or do they now have renewed vigor in pursuing their jobs?
Well, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage, and I don't say this in any way to dodge the question, Professor Nevius, because I'm not there.
Right.
But just from observing and from some contacts with people who are still on the beat, I think that most of the reporters are doing the vast majority are doing the job as they've always done it, doing the job, getting the facts, coming out and reporting it straight. And sure, you can't be human and not have it bother you if someone calls you a fake every day of the week or changes the rules constantly. But a real professional who's been at it for a long time, or maybe a real professional who is new to the beat, is just not going to let it shade their reporting. Commentators are different, and again, that goes to something that we talked about last night, and that is knowing the difference between a reporter and a commentator. But these are tough times at the White House for reporters, that's for sure.
I think it takes remarkable discipline not to be personal in all of this, and by and large, I think most of the White House reporters that I observe are doing a good job at that. If you listen to the White House briefing, they're polite. They say thank you. There's an esprit de corps and cordialness and all of that. I'm not sure if I was in their position after, being kind of verbally abused and slapped around and all of that kind of thing, that I could take it. I admire how well they're doing.
Yeah, it's surprisingly not as adversarial as you'd think it would be, at least in the briefing itself. What goes on when the lights are out and you're in someone's office or on the phone and being berated by someone is another matter, I suppose.
I guess, yeah.
Is it possible to be too polite in that situation?
Oh, yeah.
And is the current press corps perhaps being too polite?
Well, I'm not a viewer of the briefings every day. It was quite enough to stomach it for all the years that I was there. So I'm not a habitual viewer of the briefings. But yeah, there could be a tendency to maybe be too delicate, I suppose. But again, you don't want anybody to question your objectivity, or on the other hand, you also do not want if you're a reporter, you do not want this White House to succeed in painting the entire briefing room of seats of reporters as the opposition, because they are not the opposition.
I think the other thing you have to consider in all of that is sometimes you have to live again to fight another day. These people have to show up there every day to do their jobs, and as a professional, I think one of the things you would do is pick and choose your battles and all of that, because you need to be successful in all of that. There have been several instances in the last couple of months where all of a sudden a reporter is frozen out of the briefing, and their questions aren't answered anymore. Their hand goes up and they ask, but they're not asked a question because maybe they're being dinged or punished for the question they asked the day before. It's an unfortunate dynamic.
Let me say that this is not the first administration in modern times that has had tough relations with reporters. We've never seen it this bad. But when Bill Clinton first took office, there were some very tense times between the White House press corps and the White House press office. The people in charge of the press operation at that time decided that they were going to stop a long-time tradition of having the hallway between the briefing room and the press secretary's office open. They decided to shut it, and it became known to reporters who were on the beat then as a no-fly zone. They literally locked the door that was always open when Marlin was there, when previous press secretaries were there. You would go up and you just look and see if the door was open, and if Marlin was sitting behind his desk, or some of the other press secretaries from both parties, Jody Powell with Jimmy Carter, different press secretaries, if the door was open, it was sort of a signal that reporters could come in, and if something was going on and you needed a question before the briefing or after the briefing, you were on deadline. Or you'd go into the office of one of the assistant press secretaries or deputy press secretaries in what is known as the lower press office. And Bruce is going to talk more about this when he talks about the evolution of the press secretary's office, and I believe you're actually going to show them a map of what it looks like. So this was always open, and the Clinton people, for whatever reason, when they came in, they shut it down. Eventually, they reopened it. Also, the man who served as Ronald Reagan's press secretary at one time before Marlin, actually, Larry Speaks. Did you work for Larry at all?
I worked in the vice president's staff when he was
okay.
there.
Well, Larry had this phrase, "You're out of business."
Yeah.
And if there was a story that they didn't like, or some other infraction, perceived infraction, Larry would say in his Mississippi accent, "You're out of business." And I was put out of business by Larry once, and I was kind of a lowly radio network reporter. This is before I went to work for CBS. I was working for another company at the time, and had a third row seat in the White House briefing room. And my boss at the time did something that Larry didn't like. And so I raised my hand, and Larry deemed, "Peter, you're out of business." And usually when you were out of business, you could be out of business anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks, or maybe longer. And, reporters took it as kind of a badge of honor to be out of business. Well, I found out that when I was put out of business, there were some people in the lower press office, at the risk of sounding boastful, who thought, this is crazy. It wasn't his fault. His boss did something that offended Larry. And all of a sudden, for one of the first times when I was on the White House beat, people started calling and leaking things to me from the lower press office, and they'd say, we think it really sucks that Larry's put you out of business.
I'm appalled that would happen.
Yes. But did you happen to know in one case that the guy who was the chief of staff at the time, Donald Regan, did you know that he's on the outs with the First Lady, Nancy Reagan? And his days are numbered. Just wanted to give you a little heads up on that. And it was true, right?
Yeah.
And so, one day, a couple days later, I'm raising my hand at the briefing, and Larry says, well, you're out of business. And I said, yeah, Larry, thank you very much. I just want you to let you know that business is better than ever, thanks to you putting me out of business. So, again, in a lighthearted way, this isn't the first time things have been really tense between the press office and reporters, but as you can tell from those little stories, it just doesn't compare. And I also have to tell you a quick one about Marlin Fitzwater. I can't remember what it was that I got into with him about at a briefing, but we had a tussle in the briefing room back when I worked for my previous employer, an outfit called Mutual Radio. And at the end of the day, I wanted to see, is this going to be bad for me? And I went up to the press office, and Marlin's door was open, and he was sitting around this horseshoe-shaped desk that the press secretaries occupy, and he looks up, and I said, Marlin? And he said, you know what? We fight our fights, and we forget them. I've never forgotten that, what he said. In other words, we're going to have some difficulties in the briefing room. And I guess it was, sort of emblematic of my respect for the guy that I went up there, sort of to find out, just to take the temperature of the situation and see if he was angry, or as a reporter, to see if he wanted to elaborate and have something else to add to whatever it was, the long-forgotten issue that we were talking about. But he said, we fight our fights and forget them. And I've used that in other situations with bosses that I've gotten into it with over the years, and maybe even fellow reporters on the plane or on the bus where you're tussling for a deadline, and you just say, you fight you move on, in other words.
I see we're coming up to the top of the hour. Do we have time for one more question?
One more question.
Any others? Yes, sir.
How do you choose who you're going to call on? You're a spokesman. You've got a press pool in front of you. Everybody wants to ask.
Well, it depends. Back in the day, there was a hierarchy. Usually, the dean of the press corps would get called on first. For years, it was Helen Thomas from UPI. God rest her soul. She would get called on. I don't know that there's a hierarchy anymore. There's a funny story about that. When Ronald Reagan was president, they used to go through great kind of machinations to get him ready for a White House press conference and all of that. And there's a famous story about one day when he called on a reporter who wasn't there. They would give him an order to call on, and this one guy had a family emergency or somebody was sick, and the president pointed in the direction where he had on a chart that was there, and the guy wasn't there anymore. And
that also happened with President Obama once, too, when he called on someone and the person wasn't there.
President H.W. Bush, the 41st president, he actually took great pride on knowing most of the reporters by name and sight, and would call on their numbers. So I think it's just a matter. And then I can also tell you that there are some what I refer to as strap hangers at the White House. There are people who have an accreditation to the White House and a White House journalist, but I don't know where they publish or what they do or how they got the passes. And some of them raise their hands every day, and some get to ask questions and others don't.
Yeah, when the going got tough, press secretaries, not presidents, but press secretaries always knew where there was sort of a wacko reporter. I don't even want to say reporter, but a wacko occupier of a seat in the briefing room who somehow wangled a credential either permanently or for that day, and they knew that to ease the pressure or to lighten things up, you'd call on people. That could be risky too, but it would happen.
There was also a time when if the briefing got a little bit long and some of the reporter, a senior reporter might say, "Thank you, Marlin," and Marlin would say, "Thank you," and would walk off. That would be the way a reporter would end the conversation. So.
Well, and I'll say thank you.
Okay.
Good segue. Thank you.